Hey, Kent, just a marvelous background from the early days in education, from 79 in the 80s, and then, founding Aztec Professional Services. And, maybe I got some of these things wrong, but we'll correct them
Mm.
as we go forth. Pioneering with M Health, with M apps, MedApps, and all that FDA clearance work and things like that. And you're multiple times named Arizona Business Magazine's Healthcare Innovator of the Year. Multiple times honored with the Governor's Award for Innovation in Arizona. Acquisition by Alere and in corporate leadership, and just an amazing bunch of accomplishment. And then, of course, with Life 365 and the patents that you have, and working with the VA, and just amazing work, and plus integration with Microsoft. But I can see throughout this sort of marvelous background that you have, there's this sort of an ethos of servant leadership and care and integrity and working hard, and so we'll get the root of that by understanding the beginning of your journey and so on. So thank you for coming in and sharing with my audience.
Well, thank you for having me.
So, one of the questions I always ask for people with remarkable backgrounds like yourself is, from the age of 3 or 5, it could have been 10, inside, outside the family, could have been a first job, could have been other jobs later. But what were those three inflection points that made you who you are today and continues to really shape you to where you are today and into the future?
Well, it's a great question. I consider myself, I can look around at people and kind of see, is that person an old soul or a new soul on earth, right? From this. And, I consider myself, an old soul. I'm continuing to learn, right, from that. And I was a very old soul from the very beginning, from the time that I was very, very young. I attached to my grandparents and my parents, very early on. I was the third child. So the third child's always trying to, make their way, right? But also kind of on their own terms, right, as well. And so, I hung around a lot with my grandfather, very influential in my life. He was a typewriter repairman for the schools. My parents, and my grandparents and my aunts and uncles all moved from rural Iowa to Arizona when my mom was pregnant with me. And my dad was an industrial arts school teacher. Again, family was very poor, so we looked for ways, to go through and to be able to take care of ourselves, right? They're out there as well. My parents both had to work very aggressively, and my dad had to pick up side jobs, as an industrial arts teacher to be able to do cabinets and painting and yard work and all that kind of stuff. And of course, from a very young age, we were there with him, right, doing that as well. And when he got a little bit older, he started building houses, 10,000 square foot homes up in northern Arizona. And guess what I get to do every weekend when I was in high school and in college? I was driving up there either to take lumber up or help frame or paint or do electrical or whatever. So it's helped me to be handy. But from the very beginning, like when I was like 7.5 years old, I took over my brother's paper route. And as I've mentioned before, it's really odd that you would let your 7.5 year old or 8 year old today, go out and sit on a street corner and wait for papers at 4:30 in the morning when it's completely dark, and deliver on your own. And then, every Thursday night collecting money and have a bag of money and, bringing it home as well. But those were different times, right? I was more fearful of meeting up with dogs, right, growling in the alley than anything else. But, dad moved us to a farm when I was in sixth grade. I took, the paper out money that I collected. I was very studious with that, bought 20 head of sheep. And that ended up turning into 60 head of sheep. Every ewe had, twins. I had started a net worth statement. I still have it today as a cornerstone, that I kind of go look at and shows, what my assets were right at the time. I remember taking my money to the Valley National Bank, which is Chase now, and depositing it every week. And at the age of 8 or 9 or 10, by the time I was 12, I was 12 or 13, I was investing in my first stock. My mom had to sign off on it, but I found a very nice older stockbroker angel that was around that kind of helped me learn the stock market, and I could invest in, 100 or $200 at a time, in the stock market. From that, I remember, I feel guilty about this a little bit, but I remember I had probably $10,000 saved by the time I was like 14 or so, or 15, on my own money from paper outs and everything else. And I remember my mom and dad needed a little bit of money. But they wanted to buy a car. And so I drew up a promissory note at 14 and made them sign a promissory note for it as well to do it. But I bought my first car when I was 14, right? So I couldn't drive it, but it was from an auction at my dad's school, and it was an old 50 Chevy pickup truck that was just, rattled as all get out. But it was fun to fix it up. It was fun to, drive it out in the desert of Arizona. My dad would drive it out there, and then I could drive it at 14. What really shocked my dad is when I was 10 on the farm and we're out baling hay, and I wasn't big enough really to lift those bales of hay. So I had to drive the tractors. And my brothers would be on the back of the hay baler and have to stack it. And they were so mad because, I never had to stack the hay and get itchy and everything else. I was driving the tractor. But my dad was baling hay one day, and he needed the big 2 ton, truck, from the down at the hill up the top to get the hay. And he's like, go call your brothers to be able to get it. Well, I didn't call my brothers. I'm not going to do that. I went as a 10-year-old and stood on the floorboard of the 2 ton pickup truck and drove the truck up there myself to get it. And it shocked the heck out of him. But I was not afraid of doing stuff like that. My grandfather, being a typewriter repairman, taught me how to go to the swap meets with him on Saturday morning. He'd buy me a Dunkin' Donuts. We'd sit there and chat for a while. And then this is probably when I was, 7, 8, 9 years old. And then he'd teach me to pick up a typewriter, an old Royal typewriter for $5. He would clean it up over the weekend, and then he would sell it maybe the next weekend or two at the swap meet for like 20 or $25. So it just showed me there's another revenue stream, right, of stuff that we can do with it as well. And then, I would do my paper outs in the morning, and then I would go through and I would do lawn mowing the rest of the day on Saturday, from that as well. And at the time, a weekly lawn maintenance may cost us $100 a week now. But at the time I was charging $5, right? To be able to mow a lawn and trim some bushes. But, it was something I love to do. It really wasn't about the money a lot of times. It was about the mission, right? And helping people. And my last paper out I had was probably my most enjoyable because it was at an Eastern Star retirement home. And it was inside, and because I did a good job. They gave me it inside. It was all delivering inside, right, at a retirement home. But, Stephen, it took so long to collect the money there because every single woman that was there wanted me to come in and lift a box or move some furniture or sit down and have a cookie. It would take me days to do my collection at the retirement home because I wanted to help everybody, right, as well. In fact, in high school, I actually volunteered in the infirmary of that retirement home, helping with older people. I was raised by my grandparents and my parents. I lived at my aunt's house a lot of time as the third child, right, from that. So I was very, very comfortable around older people from that. And I really believe that's where my roots of starting working with chronic conditions and chronic care in helping older people live longer in their homes by using technology is what remains in my roots today.
It's kind of a remarkable background, right? I mean, sort of grounded in the rural environment, but also doing extras and things like that, and finding that you can really be an entrepreneur and generate income in different ways by service and and also thinking of ways that are not traditional in terms of value, right? Where you add value, and then from that value you can earn income and things like that. But helping others, like and that's sort of like an ethos, and your families being so grounded, and then that would lead to you having this sort of really solid foundation about integrity and hard work and care for others. And as you mentioned, because you worked in that or seniors area, then it gave you this idea of care and helping others and being able to be innovative and thinking, hey, like you said, other people would throw things out or think that had no value, and yet your grandfather would clean it up, and you can make a multiple. And
Yeah.
even at an early age, you're making multiples, right? You're keeping ledgers. And so you sort of are understanding some of the very basics of business very early on, but also having the integrity weaving through all of that. So that I can see how that shapes you to who you are today. And so now you've got this great background, integration with your family, and I can see how important your family is to you, right?
Mm.
And hard work, and but also you sort of taking charge, right? It's like your dad saying, "Hey, there's this big truck, I need it up," and get your brothers, and you just decide, "Hey, I can do that,"
Right.
and then doing the Okay, so you're very young, and so in high school, were you interested in business at that time, or were you interested in science or some kind of combination? And then let's migrate there from high school and the different jobs you're doing to, what you studied in university.
Yeah, I was interested in girls, right? Getting to know girls and stuff, right? But I knew that when I went to high school and I went to college, especially when I go to college, that I would be specializing in something, business wise. Business was always going to be my thing, right? From that. I didn't know it was going to be technology, but in high school, I did some non-traditional thing. My brother was on the varsity football team. He brought me out one season to do wrestling I was very thin when in high school. So I was like almost like at flyweight. But I wasn't good at it, right? I mean, it just wasn't my nature. I went out for the golf team. I tended to be okay for that, but I also went out for concert choir, and I met, my friends at concert choir, but it also, don't smile at me, but it was also a place to meet girls, right, as well. And I wasn't very successful. Let's just say that as well. I was very shy, right? But I also was part of Key Club. And a Key Club was typically for the athletes and the jocks, right? To be the officers on it. But my counselor, my advisor at the time, advised me to like try it out, and I became secretary of the Key Club. And so the athletic guys didn't want to do the administrative stuff, but I'm like, I'll do the administrative stuff. Don't worry about it. We traveled to Kansas City to a national convention. It was very eye-opening to me from that. But over the summer, I wrote to a lot of people in the school and said, "Hey, come join Key Club with us." And I tended to write to a lot of girls, right? Because Key Club was very much a male oriented when I was there. Now when I go back to Key Club, to do around the high school, it's almost predominantly women, at least the high school that I was at, right? From that standpoint. So I made a significant change in leadership, right? In structure, in Key Club and stuff. So I wasn't really all that obsessed with girls, but I was very shy, right? So I was trying to find my way right around. Early on, probably my sophomore year, junior year in high school, I got a job at a pharmacy where my best friend from choir, actually, we were both delivery drivers, right? From that. And then my senior year, my mom worked for Sears as a secretary, and I applied when I was 18 and got into what was called the Credit Central for approving credit on credit cards, and then also eventually, going through and doing collections, right, as well. But I remember the days that I was 18, 19 years old, and here I am, denying people credit, these are 50 and 60-year olds, 40, 50 and 60 years old. And I myself had never ever experienced credit myself or obligations myself. All I knew how to do was go run credit bureaus and make credit decisions, right, that are out there as well. So I started learning the camaraderie of working with people, with business. I started learning about how to work with major corporations when I was 18 or so. Then I decided, I'm going to college after I graduate. Instead of, I'm here in Arizona, I wanted to go to Arizona State University, but I decided I'm going to pay for it myself, right? Because, I didn't want to burden my parents with it. So I went to a junior college first. I went to Phoenix College and got my undergraduate courses or my junior level courses done first for a fraction of the cost. It was like $90 a semester, right? $200 a semester, something like that, right? To do so, and I could work. That's my only kind of regret, but I could work while I went to college, and I was working 30 hours a week, right? When I went to college as well. So my GPA wasn't a 4.0, right? It was like a 3.3, 3.4. But I also had the lessons of life there as well, right? So not only was I working, but I was going to school. So I graduated with a 2-year associate. Then I went to Arizona State University with in the business college because I knew it was going to be business. But then, I went under the computer information systems because I looked at what's going to be the most, advantageous business to make the most amount of money and have a future in the future. And it was going to be computers. And by the time, I was showing up at Arizona State University, God, it makes me sound so old. It was our last year of being on punch cards, right? For enrollment, you had to go around and get a punch card. And then the first, computers we worked on were PDP 1170. So that's the green bar that's coming up through the middle of the deck writer, right, to answer questions and stuff. Kids nowadays don't even know what that is. But then the first IBM computer, personal computer, was just coming out, right, from that as well. So it was so cool to be on this, 5.5-inch floppy disk, right? Where on the PDP 1170s, there were 8-inch floppy disk, right, from that. And learning computer side of it. The one class that really got me really interested was a Q theory class. And it was talking about Q theory, like if you open up another cashier, is it going to take the line down, or do you have only two cashiers? Is the line going to grow? And it was completely a simulation class, right, to be able to do that. The classes that kind of, got me at the community college level and at the ASU level that I wasn't really the best at was my statistics class. I just couldn't get statistics that well. And the accounting class wasn't all that great for me as well. And one of my computer classes. And then when I graduated, my first programming job was with Texas Instruments as a financial statistics programmer, right? And I'm like, so all the things that God wanted me to learn, right, in school that were tough to me, put me into practical use with it at Texas Instruments, right, in Dallas, right? So after I graduated, a few of my friends went and worked for Texas Instruments, so I wasn't there absolutely by myself. But it was the first time that I was out on my own. I stayed with my parents the whole time that I was going through college, and it was a very emotional time for me when I was getting ready to graduate because I basically said I need to be out. I need to be on my own. But I also felt an emotional tug to be able to take care of my parents and my mom and dad. My dad was living up in northern Arizona building houses, and my mom was still working for Sears, and somebody needed to take care of the house and paint it and mow the yard and do everything else. But I knew that I needed to move on and start my life right from that as well. So I did. I went to Texas Instruments and worked there for 2 years, and then came back and worked for Arizona State University for a year, and then worked for almost 10 years for American Express as a computer programmer, and then a manager right from there as well. And at American Express, that's when I really started learning. They asked me to be part of a team of 90 people called Genesis. That was a total redesign of one of their card systems. They brought people out to live in New York City for 8 months, 6 to 8 months, 90 of us together. And it was people from all around the world. Like, I'd never been around people from England before, Australia before, right? I thought everybody was from Arizona, right? And so I started having, experiences with multicultural. And then, they allowed me to travel to Japan, and I lived in London and in Brighton, England for 6 months, right, as well. So it gave me a very well-rounded, experience, right, with American Express.
So that's a really interesting journey, right? I mean, you get an associate degree, right? Because it's more accessible initially, so it makes a lot of sense. And then you transfer into ASU, Arizona State University. You get a Bachelor of Arts, but you focus on computer information systems, which is the current thing at that time, and that's in the early 80s, like what, 81 to 83. And what happens is the IBM PC comes out in 81, right? So
Yeah,
you're starting at the sort of the beginning of this marvelous revolution. And you mentioned then your next job was Texas Instruments, but Texas Instruments was a big deal, right? I mean,
yeah,
they were big, chips and manufacturer, but they're also into calculators and things like that. So it's really kind of like the state of the art. And then you do a brief stint at ASU, and then you spend 10 years at American Express. But American Express is one of the leading financial services companies in the world. And so there you get an opportunity to work as a programmer in a real professional sense, right? And it's a business environment, and you become a manager, and you lead teams, and you get experience with people from all over the world, and including you're traveling around the world. So that's really expanding who you are as a person, and then seeing what different communities, what they're like, and because you're a manager, you get to experience, well, what does that mean when you're managing groups of people like that. So you're there 10 years, and then I guess that's when you get into founding of Aztec Professional Services, right?
it kind of is. Yeah, my brothers, had gone into a business, into auto, right, a business, which was one of my brothers has a very unique talent in his brain. I can't build a computer system to kind of, keep up with his brain, but he was very good at looking at cars and auto auctions and, going through and saying, that's a Escalade. This is years ago though, right? That's an Escalade. It's in California. It's been damaged a little bit. It really would sell for $2,000 more if it was in Texas, right? Like moving cars to the right market. And they started a business that was actually buying from the rental car companies, and they would do two or 300 of these a month. Well, that really adds up, right? When you're doing that, just pointing from one. So I started putting computer. I left American Express in 1990. Yeah, I don't even really remember right now, 1996 timeframe, right? And it's no, it was a little bit before that. But so I left them and I went and worked for my brothers for like 6 months. And I put together some programs called Title Magic and Auto Magic, which, Auto Magic would go through and track all their cars and do all the paperwork for going through the auctions, right? And put tags. And that's where we're starting to get ahead of this, getting tags, barcoding tags on the cars so they could actually barcode and know the car without having to write down all the VIN and the color, the make, the mark, all that kind of stuff. And then I created Title Magic, which generates, all of the title paperwork that goes with for these two or 300 cars that need to be changed out and taken down to the Department of Motor Vehicle. And, you know, I would constantly do that. Like when I did Aztec for my staffing firm, I created a completely, automated system for resumes and putting resumes online and all this stuff called Temple for Aztec and Temple, right? Software that was out there. So, I worked for them for about 6 months or so, and then I get a call from American Express management saying, "Can you come back just for like 2 months? That's all we want you to do is come back for 2 months, because we want you to help transition new leadership in." And I ended up coming back for 2 years, And when I was there, I thought it was, like, Mr. Big Shot because, I ended with a salary, but when they said come back for, 2 months, I said, okay, well, then I want an hourly rate and I want it to be double my previous salary that I was making, right? And they said, okay, because it's only going to be for 2 months. It's fine, right, to do. And I also said when I was there, I want to have a contract to be able to bring in other contractors, underneath me as well. And they said, fine. They put me with the contracting services and let me contract. And I ended up in that 2 year period bringing 30 more people underneath me to contract with American Express because they're a big contracting firm. And I ended up leaving and creating Aztec Professional Services, which ended up doing about 800 contractors, about 100 at a time. And then I've ended up selling that to a personnel company, right, from that. But before I sold it, I had been approached by, we had started working on, because a lot of stuff was being outsourced to India, right, and other places. I wanted something that was not able to be outsourced. So we went into staffing into secret and top secret work. And I got cleared, and my wife got cleared for top secret work to be able to clear top secret people for engineering projects. And we started working with Raytheon and Orbital and other by putting engineers out. And during that time frame, and actually really interesting, I was looking for kids that are playing games, right? So I could put them up in Minot, North Dakota to fly drones, right? From
Yeah.
that, they had to be really good at flying drones. So, I learned during that time frame that we could start monitoring troops from a distance. And we wanted to look at hydration levels and troop strength and almost look like the world map behind you, like, this area is yellow, this area is green, this area is red, right? To go through and say, how we need to bolster up our troops, but we need to be able to use sensors, right, to be able to do that. Well, that kind of morphed into having, a first experiment that I was trying about putting a Bluetooth scale at the time into a phone, right? And there was no iPhone around, right? But there was a Symbian Nokia OS phone that was around. So I hired an engineer and I said, can you interface these two things together? And we created the first prototype to be able to do that with blood pressure and with weight. And lo and behold, I got introduced to McKesson, right? And McKesson and a very, very nice doctor there, Dr. John Long, who was the doctor for Reagan on the Western White House, basically took me aside and just said, listen, I'm going to teach you everything about healthcare, right? From that and all the things not to do, right? And get caught up in, and all the BS that's out there as well. You need to be able to move ahead and bring this technology in and be hypersensitive of what the need is, but realize that I think he's the one that gave me this phrase that Einstein said, the people that created the problem can't fix the problem, right? We need people from the outside to be able to look at it that aren't close to it and fix it. And that's what got me started with MedApps.
I see. So you have this Aztec Professional Services, but that's because you're at American Express and you come back under contract, but you get the ability to do subcontracting. So it gives
Yeah,
you the idea of managing other teams and outsourcing and bringing them in, and you start building that within American Express. So I could see that's such a perfect segue then into Aztec Professional Services, because then you're saying, well, why not I just create a company that does this? Ends up being a really interesting IT engineering staffing firm, and you grow it into an award-winning top-ranked provider. But because you're very sensitive of outsourcing in India, you're thinking, what can I do so that I can protect myself so that it's not going to get outsourced? So what
yeah,
what better than doing Department of Defense top secret contracting work, right?
right.
Because that's not going to get outsourced, right?
No,
And so you build this company into $60 million in community sales. You employ uh, over 800 contracting employees. You got all these internal staff, and you led that company for over a decade. And basically then that's a perfect segue into your next part, which you mentioned, because you got introduced into the healthcare system and all the things that are wrong with it, but how it could be leveraged as well for good. And you created MedApps. Okay, so let's talk about MedApps and what happened there.
So, really part of this was, out of need and necessity. And part of it was I have a very big need in my brain to be creative. I pride myself in being really in touch with marketing and brand awareness. When I see a brand that I really it's homogeneous and comes together, it really excites me, right? From that as well. It really frustrates me if our brand is not, very very easy to kind of understand and put together. And it's very tough to do a lot of times in healthcare, right? Especially who you're trying to sell to, who the ultimate customer and stuff is as well. But part of the need was, my parents were getting older. They had moved back to Iowa from Arizona. They moved on to a farm from that as well. They had both had, chronic illnesses with them. And, part of it is preventable chronic illness as well. I mean, there are things that they could have done early on to, kind of prevent the exacerbation of their disease state. So, our family is very, very mindful as we learn from our elders and others, what potentially to do, what potentially not to do from that as well. But it became incredibly important as I was thinking about MedApps and what Dr. Long has shared with me is also what the difficulties were with my parents and also the elderly people that I worked with early on when I was younger as well. They wanted to stay in their home longer. They didn't want to be, in assisted living or into a home. And the biggest problem too is how far is their money going to go? Right? They weren't rich. I mean, they had enough, right, to be able to potentially go so far, but they could not afford to have assisted living like draining their savings because, from that perspective, what were they going to become a ward of the state or have to move in with one of us, right, from that, which they didn't want either. So one of the first solutions that I put together was, the devices that go to a Symbian phone or to a Nokia phone, and we put it out in the marketplace, and I was the mobile rules winner for Nokia in San Jose back in 2008 timeframe with that company. Um, and they flew me to Finland to be able to be with the other mobile rule winners, but I was the winner in healthcare. And I can tell you, the engineers there wanted really nothing to do with me, right from that, because they're like, "Hey, we don't need to listen to you. We can create this stuff ourselves," right? To do that, and ultimately, I think that was a lot of Nokia's demise from a kind of having that kind of thinking, not looking at what the future is, but having more of a thinking of like, they can do it themselves when ultimately they need to see where the future's headed. But, when we started to first deploy, the technology with the Symbian phones, we found we're deploying with a Medicaid population, a poorer population, and it really came down to need. We'd find a lot of times that the phones would be used for other things other than taking their readings, or their sons or daughters may, misappropriate them, and use them for other things, or they may sell them just out of necessity because they're hungry and need to buy food. So we went back to the drawing board. We couldn't afford when the iPhones came out to put a $1,500 iPhone in every Medicaid patient's home. It was just too unrealistic, too expensive, and may get abused. So we went back and created, out of necessity, from the hardware, from the ground up, a device called the Health Pal. And the Health Pal had built-in cellular inside of it. I mean, who goes and builds their own phone, right? But we did, right? And has Bluetooth with it and connected to all these devices. But I called it a non-hockable device. It was a dedicated unit. It was a hub, right? From that, and but as normal, I was way ahead of my time. People that would go in this marketplace, there was no reimbursement for connecting with patients at home. people would say, "Ah, you're crazy. People are just going to use, a cell phone, and users are all going to have their own cell phones. They'll just use them themselves in the future." And some of that is true, and a lot of that is not true, right? From that as well, like 10 years later, 15 years later, it's all about connecting with people, but a lot of it has to be the cellular has to be built into the devices. And that's exactly what I was doing, but I was doing it way too early, right? As well. So that company we built, we put about 80 patents around it. It's interesting when I was getting ready to transition from Aztec over to MedApps, my wife asked me like, what do you want to do? I was probably 4 years old. What do you want to do with the rest of your life? And I'm like, I want to be an inventor. And she said, invent what? Right. And I said, I don't know. I think I want to invent, connected technology that helps people, right? From that. So here I am in the garage. I'm already good with woodworking. I'm already good, with electrical and stuff like that. And, I have the Johnson one touch glucose meter, and I'm like, I want it to plug into a cable that goes to the phone, or I want it to plug in a cable that goes to wireless. So I created this cradle that it sits in out of clay, and I still have it today, right? And then I created, I started talking to Medtronic and stuff, and wanted to talk to their implantable devices. And I'm like, I want to build this really thin, credit card size device, maybe a quarter inch thick, that talks to the implantable device, then talks to the phone on the mixed frequency, the 402 to 405 frequency. And I made it out of wood. And the first investors I went to, they're like, am I looking at clay? Am I looking at wood? Right? And I'm like, you are. And they said, you can get that made through SLA, right? Out there, you can use SolidWorks and put it together. And that was the next thing I did. I brought in, a guy that with me, that in a team with me, my friend that did graphic design, but a team that did hardware design, but also a very good graphic designer and SolidWorks designer. And it was a great team for the 8 or 10 years we were together, because we could go through and ideate devices, create them, put them into SolidWorks. My engineering team could go play with it and have it ready within a day or two, like in a skunkworks environment, and then we could actually show it to people really quickly. That company sold in 2012, to Alere, which was a Fortune 500 company. Um, they sold to, and I became the president of the Alere Connect division, which our responsibilities were to connect everything that was coming out of the hospital and the doctor's office to the health information exchange.
Yeah, I mean, it was a great transition, right? And you were also, during this time period, a little bit earlier, recognized as a healthcare innovator, right? I mean, several times named Arizona's Business Magazine's Healthcare Innovator of the Year. So it's such a perfect fit.
Yep.
Multiple times honored with the Governor's Award for Innovation in Arizona's. And really, you're an inventor. So, and definitely an innovator, an entrepreneur, but you very much a translational person where, well, what's the practicality of this? It's got to be sustainable. You have to be to sell it. It has to address a particular market segment. I mean, you did this all and you get acquired by Alere and you end up being the CEO president, as you mentioned, Alere's Connected Health Division, which must have been great, right? Because you led R&D efforts in telehealth and introducing two new remote monitoring hub devices,
Yep.
home link and mobile link, and completing development of Alere's cloud care platform for patient monitoring, health management, and it really then set you up for then Life 365. So let's now talk about Life 365.
Yeah, there's one thing I'm just going to interject really quickly in between is I would, in the first foray in going into healthcare, I would go through and almost be apologetic, like I'm a technology person coming into healthcare because I don't know as much as doctors. And today I still don't know as much as I'm not a doctor, right, that's out there, but I'm a technologist. But I would always say going in, that I would try to use the 80/20 rule, like, 20% of the effort, yields 80% of the bang for the buck. I would consider myself, probably putting myself down a little bit, but I don't need to do that. I have a sense of humor as well. But I would say that I'm the weirdo in the group, in the industry, because, I don't believe that you need to have, $500 devices shipped out to everybody, to my mom and dad, to try to nudge them into compliance. It's a little bit of data to understand where mom and dad are coming from and try to incent them to engage them in their own care, right? To get them, moving and going and making sure they take their medication. It's little things you have to learn about it. And what I'm so excited about going into this generation we're going into right now is that, doctors don't need any more data, but, AI is thirsty for it. It needs all the data it can get. It wants data to understand how mom and dad engaged. Mom had three computers and two tablets, right? I could pick her up anywhere, in engagement. Dad was completely off the grid, right? The only way I could get to dad was maybe through a smart TV, right? From that, or through mom, right? To do that. In fact, just a really quick story. When I was at Alere, we had invented the mobile link to connect to INR devices for measuring blood thinning because mom was on Coumadin at the time and she could do it at home. But the old procedure at Alere, they had like 75,000 people that are on these blood thinning INR devices, was to have a nurse call and talk to my mom, right? And to get her readings and say, Jackie, how are you feeling? And spend 20 minutes with her. And she loved that, right? She was 1,500 miles away from us. That was another person she could talk to, right? When her son invented a device that basically replaces the nurse, right? I became the evil son because now Dorothy doesn't call her on a weekly basis and talk to her. She just takes her reading and, if the reading's okay, nobody calls. She learned how to manipulate the reading to make it a bad reading so that it would fail the system and that Dorothy would have to call. And that's where I learned a lot about, engagement and psychology and human factors and everything that kind of goes into it, right? In the whole field of dreams, like in healthcare, just because you build it doesn't mean they'll come, right? You've got to make sure it engages the right people on their terms, right product, right place, right cost for the right outcome, right? From that as well. So there's a lot of lessons I learned in the MedApps space, a lot of lessons, from that. And the market was starting to evolve, and I started seeing like CVS acquiring Aetna, and Walmart starting to get more involved into healthcare, and healthcare professionals were leaving rural America, right? From that perspective, I learned a lot about our veterans, at the time because I testified at MedApps in front of the House Subcommittee on Veterans Affairs, about bringing new and innovative technology to, the VA at that time. And the VA was still, using, old wired stuff at end of life with people instead of being proactive, right? So we're trying to show the House Subcommittee and the VA new ways to innovate with people. But I knew we're going to have to do more with less as healthcare profession was starting to dwindle, right? In fact, we're going to lose 800,000 nurses in this current environment by the time we get to 2027, 2028, another 800,000. So, and we're graduating 10,000 people per day turning 65. Technology is going to play an important role. But when I was exiting MedApps, I knew really not a lot about AI at the time. Not a lot of people did. We weren't using it in healthcare yet. And we didn't have reimbursement still in place, but we knew we had analytic systems and we knew we'd have to, that technology would have to play an important role. So in between the time we sold and I started Life 365, I sat down for about a year in an executive suite and wrote 1,500 pages of provisional patents, right, on the next generation of healthcare, right, from that. And it was going to be around, putting, very thin wearable devices on people's wrists to collect data, if we could do that. You're going to have to be smart about how you put wearables on people's wrists because with a senior environment, if you're having to take it off the wrist and charge it, there's a high likelihood it's not going to go back on the wrist, right, as well. And so our first time out, we decided to go after and create a wearable. Fitbit was, in the marketplace, but it was really only addressing health and wellness. It really couldn't transition over into healthcare from that. But then it started seeing its sales go down because people were figuring out that it wasn't moving even the health and wellness, and the healthcare cost all that much in large self-insured employers, right? So we started working on a wearable that I called a careable, right, for care, to be able to put on people's wrist, and to a lot of it to be around my mom. And we created a bunch of different things with it. We put NFC on it, right? So you could take and touch, medication containers like this and touch them to the wearable side and record the medication. That not only does it in the cloud, but it lets me, her son, know that she took her medication. It closes the loop on care, right, from that as well. But we also, put on it a nudge feature, a feature, before the nudge book was written, right? A nudge feature to just go, Mom, I'm thinking about you. And a heart would show up on it, that Kent's thinking about you, or a picture, of a child or the new grandchild in the family, right? To make that social connection between my mom and my dad and between our family, right, as well. So we filed for the patents on the wearable devices we created a new operating system to make it really super lean and powerful, and that we could run the wearable for months, on single charge, instead of having it come off and have to be recharged all the time. From that perspective, we acquired companies that do small little sensors that can do heart rate and heart rate variability. We acquired medication adherence companies to be able to get the data as well. But we were granted those patents, right, from that. So we're a top patent holder here in the US, not only on coordinating interoperability from electronic health records to home, right, but also to now get precious data off of wearable devices and sensors that allow us to start what I called shift left instead of staying on. There's this hump that I kind of show from time to time, and it shows health and wellness on the left hand side, but it shows complex care on the right hand side. And the last 50% of healthcare costs are generated by 5% of the population, and usually it's in the last 6 months of their life. But in the middle of this hump are people that are newly chronic, not spending a lot of money quite yet on healthcare, right, from that. And they need to be connected in a very cost effective and light way to be able to, nudge them into compliance and try to, reduce their healthcare costs before they become an expense. And so that's the premise of where Life 365 came from. It's to not be part of those 200 or 300 RPM companies that are out there today that wait for somebody to become incredibly sick and then they ship them out devices. They take a more proactive role. We take a more proactive role, whether it's disposable sensors or voice biomarkers or facial acquisition of data, right, that's out there, and trying to build a platform that brings this all together into the home and connects it to an intelligent platform so that people don't have to guess any longer. If you're an insurance company and you're in charge of 1 million people, you don't know who's going to go to the emergency room next. You don't know who's going to incur healthcare costs, right, from that. But with this type of data, you should be able to start ranking people and say, I've got electronic health record data, I've got claims data. In an AI environment, that's great data for learning. I learned from the electronic health record data that any time that Kent's blood pressure gets above 160, that his weight grows for more than 4% overnight, that his SpO2 or his oxygen saturation gets below 88, that he's going to head to the emergency room in the next 7 to 10 days, right? And they get that from that previous data. What they don't have is the current observational or longitudinal data to know what's happening with Kent today. So Life 365 goes through and puts that data together for today. It makes the connectivity, it makes the cost work, it makes the engagement work, it makes the interoperability work, so we can scale to millions of people to get that data to make those models of care work.
Yeah, I mean, it's quite, just fascinating what you're doing, and it's a great way to close in a way. We only have a couple of minutes left, but
Yeah.
you created this Life 360. It's a virtual care platform. It's definitely frictionless between providers and patients at home. It's integrating hundreds, like what, over 550 types of home medical devices. It's built for scalability. You partner with Microsoft Cloud for Health. You're enabling connectivity with thousands of healthcare systems, or over 1,000 anyways. You'll be granting all these patents. You're definitely next generation AI-driven wearables,
Yeah.
remote patient monitoring. You've done this amazing stuff with Veterans Health Administration Initiative, joining consortium worded this, the multi-year contract to expand remote patient monitoring for veterans nationwide. This billion plus program. I mean, I could see how this integrates. It's really the future, and you've done it today, and it's accessible to all. And are you working with David Rue at Microsoft? We have to make it really quick. We don't have much time, but have you worked with David Rue, Chief Medical Officer with Microsoft? Are you working with Stephen Shia then with J&B Medical? Because I see such a great fit here.
Yeah. So start with Stephen first. We did obviously I consider Stephen a friend, right, from that. So we've done multiple projects, along the way with J&B and with his team, especially when his dad was alive. We did a project where we bid it with the University of Michigan, right,
Okay.
from that to be able to do with J&B. The Dr. David Rue, I used to have my own podcast for 4 years called The New Normal. And I was very fortunate to bring a lot of thought leaders in together, and Dr. Rue was very generous with this time coming in to talk about Microsoft. Microsoft was part of our VA bid as well. So I also have a chief medical officer, Dr. Tom Osborne, right? That's part of Microsoft as well. That a really good person to be part of with Microsoft relationship.
So this is our very last question, and what sort of recommendations do you want to leave the audience and or questions? Now, clearly, you want the entire universe to take a look at and get engaged with and promote and advocate for Life 365 because it's such a great ecosystem and platform you developed. But what recommendations? And then again, if there's any questions you want to leave the audience.
Yeah, the only thing I'll say is that I am not looking to solve, the whole problem, right, that's out there. I am part of the connected tissue that's needed to be able to be, it takes a village, right, to be able to put this together. So there are key players out there that do electronic health records very well. There are key players out there that do clinical care very, very, very well. There are key players that do engagement incredibly well, or voice biomarkers, or facial acquisition or AI incredibly well. It's about bringing that ecosystem together, and that's where we see, when I look introspectively, or I listen for my message from my guides, right, from that are out there. It is for me to be that connected tissue to make sure that that can work, right, from that as well. So when people are saying I need to take care of a bigger population, but I've got all this other data that's out there, but I need this data set, I'm like, I've got you. I've got that data set right for you. And that's what allows that friction to be removed, right? And allows it to start shifting left and scaling to much broader populations. My hope, my dream from this is allow seniors, including myself, to live in their home much, much longer. This is how I would prefer to be interfacing with my doctor, right? Very conveniently to do that. But my closest dream, right, is that I want to start intervening with our veterans much earlier in the cycle. The VA has not found a lot of joy in the current interaction and connecting with patients, and they're waiting until the last 6 months of their life. We should be starting with active service members in the Defense Health Agency and their families, and let them start progressing with it through the rest of their life, not at the end of their life.
Well, those are, really great recommendations. And Kent, thank you for coming in. Just a really remarkable background of contribution and invention, and really enjoyed our time together.
Thank you, Stephen. I really appreciate you having me.
Thank you for listening to the Brand Called You videocast and podcast, a platform that brings you knowledge, experience, and wisdom of hundreds of successful individuals from around the world. Do visit our website www.tbcy.in to watch and listen to the stories of many more individuals. You can also follow us on YouTube, Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. Just search for the Brand Called You.